Okay,
So, computational neuroscience has come a long way since the 1980s when I got into the game. And there were three major, really important events that helped kickstart the field. First of all, back in the 80s, the Sloan Foundation started a Computational Neuroscience Centers program before anybody even knew what Computational Neuroscience was, which is really important because it allowed us to bring in postdocs. And it was like 6 centers. But it was the CRCNS program that actually allowed our students to actually do the research, because without funding, you can't get very far in academia. And kudos to Ken Wang for figuring out how to thread the needle through the bureaucracy. It was unprecedented, I think. But then finally, there was the BRAIN Initiative. So I was on the panel. It was a committee to advise the director of NIH, Francis Collins at the time, on the BRAIN Initiative. There were 15 of us. And I argued really, really strongly for computation, models, statistics, and theory. And I think if it had just been me, I'm not sure that my colleagues would have taken that seriously and included in the 7 key goals of the BRAIN Initiative. But Eve Martyr, bless her soul, who was already doing modeling in her lab, explained to the experimental people how important it was. And so, I really owe her a lot. We really do. She was really extraordinarily helpful. Well, now we're living in a different age. There has been two major revolutions in the last 10 years. This only happens, very rarely. There's a revolution that has occurred in artificial intelligence. In the last century, AI was dominated by artificial intelligence was dominated by logic, rules, and symbols. And if you wanted to look for a symbol in the brain, good luck. It's just the signals. The brain is all about signals, not symbols. But that changed with machine learning. That allowed us to build computational structures based on data. And then finally, most recently, deep learning, about 10 years ago, where we were able to get the networks with enough stages, levels, to be able to tackle big problems. And you'll see that. But on the other hand, something else has happened, which I think is equally important, and it has to do with the fact that in the last century, we could only record from 1 neuron at a time. Now we can record routinely from tens of thousands of neurons from dozens of brain areas at the same time. And so that means that we can get a global picture. And that has changed my thinking, and conceptual framework now is changing toward large populations of neurons rather than 1 neuron at a time. And that's a tough job. It's as difficult as looking at an image 1 pixel at a time. Just think of how difficult it would be and how many pixels you'd have to look at before you figured out what was out there. Now, one step now we're at, which is really quite remarkable, there's no doubt that AI has greatly benefited from neuroscience. Basically, the architectures that they're using now are really very simplified versions of the kind of architecture. By architecture, I mean simple processing units, highly interconnected, and the secret sauce are learning algorithms, right? That's clearly how the brain works, with very sophisticated machinery. But now we have opportunity for crosstalk between the AI side for the first time and neuroscience. And that's what I want to tell you about today. First of all, it's clear that they benefit from us, but I think we could benefit from AI. I'm going to try to convince you of that. This field is called NeuroAI. NIH and NSF all have had symposia and meetings to bring together people at that intersection. And it's not everybody. You have to have your foot in both sides in order to be able to be able to do that integration. Now, this really goes back to the 1990s when I first came here to La Jolla. Pat Churchill and I wrote this book. As you can see, it's already past its 25th anniversary, The Computational Brain. And in it, what we tried to do was use the tools that were available at the time for training small networks on problems that, computational problems that we knew the brain needed to solve. And that way we got a feeling for what it was like to create what we call distributed representation. So that if you look at one neuron, you really can't tell what that neuron is doing, except in the context of all the other neurons in the population that is involved in doing some computation. And I'm going to give you an example. This is probably the most ambitious small network in that era. It's a little bit of the 21st century in the 20th. This is called NetTalk. It's text-to-speech. So it's actually a very difficult problem. English is very irregular. There are all kinds of exceptions to any rule. And the phonologists, they write 400-page books on this. So what we did, though, this is Charlie Rosenberg was a visiting summer student from Princeton, where he was working with George Miller, who's a cognitive psychologist. And so we took in 7 letters. We have input units, we have 1 layer of hidden units, and 1 output unit for the sound, 44 different phonemes. And like a C in cat is hard, but if it was city, then it would be a soft C sound. So vowels can have 6 or 7 different sounds, so it's really complicated. So this is what it sounds like when learning begins with backprop. Oops. Unfortunately, okay, I actually have memorized it. Ba 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 ga da da ba, mama. Okay, it babbles, and it really was very remarkable when I played this for the audiences, because it was just stunning that you could fit so much complexity into a network with a few hundred units in 10,000 ways. I mean, it was really quite remarkable for that era. And then finally, here's the test set. And if I played this, you could understand that it was actually able, after a night's training on a VAX, which is a million operations, floating point operations per second, right? That was less than my watch. It was able to do that. It was really quite remarkable. What really, in retrospect, it was telling us is that this architecture loves language. I mean, really, just fits right in there. Okay, well, the big breakthrough occurred in 2012 when Jeff Hinton and his graduate students lowered the error rate on the largest data set of labeled images. There was 20,000 categories, 20 million images. They lowered it by 10%. And in computer vision, that was going down by less than 1% per year. So it's like jumping 10, 20 years into the future. Within a year, you couldn't compete with neural networks if you're doing computer vision. I've never seen a field turn on its 180, that quickly. If you live by the sword benchmark, you die by the sword. Now, Jim DeCarlo did something really clever. What he did was to compare the codes that the trained network, the convolutional neural network, which, by the way, that's Jan LeCun, who actually was the one who developed it. And it actually has remarkable resemblance to the primate visual system. In fact, if you look at each of the units, there's a linear filter that's like a simple cell. Then there's a nonlinearity and a grouping that's called a complex cell. So there's a lot of and there's normalization that's done with inhibitory cells in the cortex. So in any case, what Jim did on the very same stimuli, he compared the population activity in each of these layers here with the population activity in the recordings that he did from V4, from V1, V4, and infratemporal. And what he showed was that you can, with the linear regression, you can actually get very good predictions for going between these levels, which really was telling us that maybe, despite the fact that we're using a different learning algorithm from the one the brain uses, there's only one way with this architecture you're going to solve the problem. And by the way, the really difficult part is invariances, which is scale invariance, translation invariance, rotation invariance, and find 3D rotation. Very complex. That is the real problem in being able to recognize an object. And of course, there are many types of cups and cats and so forth. So the generalizing is absolutely essential. So I want to focus on memory, and there are many time scales. There is, first of all, short-term sensory memory. Sensory information comes in, doesn't last very long because more is coming in, so you have to make room for the additional information. So it's less than a second. And then you can remember things in working memory. For example, a telephone number, right? You can remember it for maybe a minute unless you rehearse it. But there's another type of working memory psychologists call long-term working memory. And this is what's happening in your brain right now. Your brain is taking in word after word, slide after slide, and at the end, you'll remember enough to ask a question. That's a lot of information that you're taking in. And you can think about it in terms of what you already know. Now, tomorrow, you may not remember very much, just a very sketch of what the talk was about, maybe some of the jokes, and maybe if you take notes, some take-home messages. But while you are here for at least an hour or two, you can it really take in and remember an enormous amount of information. And that's really the problem that I'm interested in working on. And finally, there's long-term memory. We know that goes way back to your childhood, and so it's really this band of minutes to hours that I want to explore. Now, when you talk to ChatGPT, it seems to have a long-term working memory as long as you have a dialogue going, right? Well, first of all, it's generative. That means it generates word after word, just like we do. It's pre-trained with an enormous amount of data. And the key is the transformer that I'm going to be telling you about. So how is it that the transformer is able to keep track of your question and then all along, right? As long as you keep the dialogue going, it's responding the way a human would, right? It has a long-term working memory. However, it's not human. The only thing we can be sure of is as if an alien landed on Earth and within a very short time started talking to us in English, right? That's what happened to us, 3 years ago. And the only thing we can be sure of is it's not human. And here's one big difference. There are a lot of differences, but this is the biggie. And that is when you stop your dialogue, it goes silent. Nothing. There's no self-generated activity. You can sit down, you could plan in the future, you can think back in the past without any sensory input, without any motor output, right? So if we could crack this in the human brain, we might be able to actually help AI. But first, we have to figure out how the brain does it. And here is the architecture simplified, which I think is going to give us a hint. So here's your query that comes in. The query comes in, it's encoded, and it goes into a decoder, which is actually, this is just one module that's stacked up, dozens and hundreds of modules because each one is becoming more abstract. And finally, when you get to the top, it picks one word, which then it outputs, and that word goes back to the input. And that input is getting longer and longer. It's a long input vector. So this is actually the long-term working memory. It's the long input vector. In other words, what the transformer does is it takes a sequence of words and converts it into a big spatial vector. Okay, now we don't have a buffer like that. We're not a digital computer, but is there some way the brain can manage that with the machinery we know it has? Well, let's look at the known electrical activity that might help us. This is actually taken from our computational brain book. Log scale here from milliseconds up to hours. And here's various parts of neurons and things that we know, like synapses and action potentials in the millisecond range. And, there are other ion channels that go for hundreds of milliseconds. But once you start getting out here into the minutes and hours, there aren't a lot of mechanisms. There's, of course, LTP and LTD, which probably are for long-term memory, but we don't want LTP. because it's really important that it's temporary, because you want to go to another lecture. In fact, if you go to the SFN meeting, you're going to be going from one after the next and so forth. I mean, you're not going to be able to remember all of them, right? So you have to flush the details of one to get make room for the details of the next one. And at some point you saturate, and that's when you basically should just go out for a walk so that the brain can clear out. Okay, so this is what we want to do, is figure out what mechanisms could fill in this hole here. Now, we've known that the brain oscillates in many frequency bands, and this is the gamma band, 40 to 80 hertz. And here's a recording. Local field potential lasts for a few hundred milliseconds. It's actually a burst. It's not a sine wave, and it's broadband. And there's a unit activity. Here's a spectrogram. Here, 40 to 80 hertz. Now, we have an array, and this is taken from Mark Snitzer, actually optical recording, voltage sensitive dyes. And now these are 4 recordings from spaced by 0.5 millimeter. And what you can see is that the peaks are organized in a row, which means that this is a traveling wave. It's sweeping across the cortex. So here's another example. We think that working memory probably is the kind that we want to understand. A lot of it's going to be in the prefrontal cortex. Earl Miller is going to give a talk tomorrow about traveling waves in prefrontal cortex. And here's the task. The task is you get an object, you probably can't see it, it's a banana. The fixation, then there's a banana, delay period, 2 seconds, and then you get 2 objects and you have to move your eye to the one that you had previously seen. That's called delay match a sample. Now, I'm sorry, this is really, okay, got it. Here now this is the LFP. I'm trying to use the cursor so everybody else can see it out there, but it's interfering with the advancement here. Okay, so here are 4 frequency bands, theta 4 to 8, all the way up to gamma. And what you can see is that there's a big burst of energy here in LFP right after the test image comes up. And it turns out to be traveling waves in all those bands. And here's an example for the beta band. You can see now these are frames and across 28 milliseconds. And you can see that there's a wave going across both in amplitude and in phase. Here are the phases. You can actually see the progression of the wave across the cortex. Not only that, but it's modulated by the task itself. And he's done several tasks. He has a new paper that came out in Neuron just about a month ago. And he's going to be telling you about, I visited him a couple of weeks ago, and he's going to be telling you about work that hasn't been published yet. It's really truly astonishing what he's done, and showing that this is a valid, possible candidate for working memory. Now, as I said before, traveling waves have been seen in every frequency band. In fact, we have a review paper here on the bottom, which cites 100 papers where people have seen traveling waves, but they've been ignored by and large by the community. And there's a simple reason: no known function. It's not really clear why they're there. I was once introduced, talking about introductions, at a distinguished lecture by someone who said, Terry's going to be telling you about gamma oscillations. These are the exhaust fumes of the brain. And I suspect a lot of other systems neuroscientists felt the same way. By and large, even ignoring oscillations, even though we know that, for example, gamma, the bursts occur when you pay attention to something. That's a cognitive function, paying attention. And by the way, the only thing that goes to long-term memory is something you attend to. So there you go. There's a link already there. But it turns out that there are waves at different spatial scales. For example, local waves, the gamma only goes as far as the boundary of V1 to V2. And then I'm going to show you some global waves that are over the whole cortex and everything in between. Now, here is one of the things that a wave can do for you. This Reichart detector was a very simple little cartoon of a model that Werner Reichart cooked up to do compute the direction of motion of a visual stimulus. So the visual stimulus comes in here at time t minus delta t, and then it goes horizontally, and there's long-range horizontal connections that go millimeters to A. So when the visual stimulus now travels from B to A. So when A visual stimulus comes into A, the input from B comes in at the same time, and then they add and they go above threshold. And that will give you a signature of something that's moving to the left. And if you do the opposite direction, nothing happens unless you have something going in the opposite, another axon going in the opposite direction. Now that's a little core. Adelson Bergen put it together into an energy model, and it is standard and used in computer vision for figuring out where, there's motion going on in a large image, a video. Now, we can expand this now. Let's generalize it. Let's look here on the right. Here's a neuron at time t. And by virtue of the lateral interactions coming in from all of the neurons here at different times, the spike here can be influenced. The timing of the spike can be influenced by all of the activity that has occurred in that blue triangle, which is a space-time window, spatial input coming in at different times. And what that means is that the new code that neuron can participate in is not just representing what's happening right now, but also what's happened in the recent past, a time window. And that's a much more powerful representation. Okay, so traveling waves, that takes you probably, up to maybe 10 seconds, and maybe in the prefrontal cortex, with recurrent networks, you can probably take it up to a minute, but probably not 2 hours. So we need another mechanism, and something that lasts that long probably is going to be mediated by synaptic plasticity. So let's look around. Is there any mechanism that we know that could do temporary hold on to synaptic potentiation or depression for an hour or a few hours? Okay, well, it turns out that there's something called STDP, spike time dependent plasticity, and this is in the hippocampus here on the right. And I want to point out just a couple of things. First of all, the only time when you actually get, I'm going to give up on my cursor, okay? The only time that you get LTP or LTD is if the presynaptic input occurs just before or within 20 milliseconds, in which case it potentiates, or 20 milliseconds after, in which case it depresses. So it's a very narrow time window, plus or minus 20 milliseconds. But look at this knife edge. That's even more impressive. That means that plus or minus a few milliseconds makes the difference between whether you're going to potentiate or whether you're going to depress. And there's no known mechanism for regulating that timing at the millisecond level, right? So this may be great in vitro experiments, which is where this was done, but there's no evidence, there's very little evidence, very weak evidence that this is actually occurring in the cortex. And partly just how do you regulate the stimulus itself in the cortex when you stimulate? Okay, well, some hints are coming from this is the discovery paper in Science by Henry Markram in Sockman's lab. And a couple of things. First of all, they didn't just give it one pairing, they gave it bursts of 4 pairings, ranging in frequency from 4 hertz up to 40 hertz. And they repeated that burst 10 times, spaced by a second. So that's 40 pairings. And as you can see, they maintained the potentiation depression there for about 40 minutes. Now, what they didn't report, though, what I've subsequently heard, is that if you don't repeat the burst 10 times, but only 5 times, doesn't last that long. You get a little bit of the temporary increase, maybe 2 or 3 bursts will take you up to about half an hour. But it's clear that this is actually a pretty good candidate, not for long-term potentiation, but for working memory, for temporary And interestingly, look at the frequency range here. First of all, nothing happens if you're below 10 hertz, 2 and 4 hertz. Pairing does nothing. But as soon as you do 10 hertz, which is alpha, you get up to about 25%. And if you take it up to 40 hertz, you get about 50%. This is exactly the frequency bands of the traveling waves. So this is a great match. Now, what about the timing? Traveling waves come through. There's a wavefront. And the wavefront is going to hit a neuron in two different ways, directly in the dendritic tree, but also through inhibitory interneurons. We know that because we know that there is non-classical receptor fields that are suppressive. So the inhibitory neurons are getting an input too. And the inhibitory input, if it's strong enough, will cause a hyperpolarization in the cell body. And if you do that, there's a release from inhibition, which means you get a back-propagating action potential up the apical dendrite. And now anything that is any EPSP within a window of 20 milliseconds will be temporarily potentiated. That's an incredible way to regulate spike timing ways. So this is a plausible mechanism, and we'll see. Now, another question is, well, which synapses? Because the distribution of synaptic strengths on the excitatory strengths on pyramidal cells has, as you can see, a lot of small weights and then a long tail. It's actually a log normal distribution. And it's known that the big ones are the most stable. They're the ones that probably have your long-term memories. But the ones that are small are labile. If you look on successive days, they get bigger and smaller, and they actually turn over. Some disappear and a new one's appearing. So this is a pool of synapses that is there to be used for temporary memory. And how many are there? It's about 90% of all the excitatory synapses in the cortex. That's a lot of synapses. That's the vast majority of synapses. So that could serve as the pool, the reservoir for long-term working memory. Now, I mentioned that we have one example of global traveling waves, and that occurs when you fall asleep. So this is now data that was taken from epilepsy patients in collaboration with Sid Cash at Mass General Hospital. What the neurosurgeon does is put an array of electrodes on the surface of the cortex. So this is directly, it's a potential that was going on in the superficial layers. And what they're doing now, they'll insert it and wait for a couple of weeks. What they're doing is looking for the focus of the seizures. So they're waiting for seizures to occur. And when they have identified that, they go in and they extirpate the part that they think would stop the seizures. Now, it's not always successful, but even if it's partially successful, it's enormously important for these drug-resistant cases. But now we have access to wonderful data because, of course, they are sleeping every day, and we now can analyze what's going on in their cortex while they're sleeping. And it turns out that as you fall asleep, the pattern of activity changes dramatically from low amplitude, high frequencies to high amplitude, low frequencies. And there's four different stages, and one of them, stage 2, is one in which you get what are called sleep spindles. They're 10 to 14 hertz. They last 1 or 2 seconds. They recur thousands of times during the night. It was thought for a long time that they were synchronous across the cortex. And in fact, that's true. The whole cortex is spindling. The spindle gets initiated or triggered by the hippocampus, which is replaying things that have happened during the day. And we know, and this is an experiment that has been done on humans with drugs, that if you increase the density, the number of spindles, you will remember more about what you learned the previous day. So, there's a good chance that this has something to do with the consolidation of your experiences and things that have happened to you and into long-term memory from this temporary memory. Okay, so I'm going to play a movie. We've normalized the potential on the surface so that it goes between black and white, and you can see that one point with that is red dot is the one that's black. And you can immediately see that the peaks of the other electrodes is not exactly the same. So there's phase offsets. And so the question is, what is the overall pattern? Is it just random, or is there some global structure? This is unfortunate. This happens when, oh, maybe it's going to go. Okay, this happens with Zoom. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay.
I just want to make this.
Okay. Well, okay. Zoom for some reason interferes with my videos. Do you know how to fix it?
I think you should stop the share, and then you should optimize when you share for videos. There is this option you can select.
Oh, okay. Okay, stop share.
Stop share, yeah. And now share again.
Share again, okay.
This one, yeah. And then you should have somewhere to tick, optimize here. You should tick these, optimize for sound and for video.
Okay.
And then this should stop.
Okay, thank you. If this works, it'll be a miracle.
May I please do one more thing? Just to make your screen a little bit better. Now, yeah. Screen.
Oh, that's much better. Yeah, thank you. We should have done that from the beginning. Okay. Okay, well, here's the true test now to see if we can get this video up. Alas. Okay, well, I've seen this before, so I can tell you what you're going to see. It's really quite remarkable. What happens is, see the white region in temporal cortex, it rotates up here to the parietal cortex, and then from here to the prefrontal cortex, it goes around and around and around. And it does that 10, 20 times in a single spindle. And the reason why that's really interesting from our perspective in terms of why is it rotating, why is it's global. And the reason is that we've modeled it, and it turns out that the timing of the speed at which it goes is determined by the long-range association fibers, the big myelinated fibers. The ones within the cortex, they're horizontal connections within the cortex. They're not myelinated, they're small, they're very slow, 1/10 of a micron. But these are fast, and so that means it takes like 10, 20, 30, 40 milliseconds to go from one cortical area to the next. And that turns out to be about the right time so that when the traveling wave arrives at a location, the input from the thalamus is arriving within plus or minus 20 milliseconds. So it could be that STDP is actually used here in that process of transferring working memory into long-term memory. Okay, now, one of the problems, or at least the concerns, is that, well, these are epilepsy patients. Maybe what you're seeing is abnormal. So we asked for volunteers from normal people, and we didn't get any, control. Unless there's someone here that wants to. But we did find some volunteers amongst the babies at April Benicic studies. By the way, this is not April. This is one of the young little infants, 6 months old. And she does high density EEG recordings. And it turns out because the babies have cartilaginous skulls, it hasn't hardened yet, and it needs to bend because it needs to go through the birth canal. And because of the fact that it's, at that point, the head is small, recordings from the surface of the scalp is almost as good as from the surface of the cortex. Beautiful spindles, very high amplitude spindles. And if you could see this is now rotating. Can you see the rotating? And there's a traveling wave that goes across both hemispheres. And it's just beautiful. It just keeps going back over and over and over again. Okay. What a pity. Okay, so in any case, let's go on. So finally, let's take a closer look at the transformer. This is now a little less schematic than before. And what you can see here is that if this is this is the module I showed you, there's two colors. One is a blue box, and that's the feed forward box. And then there's a a kind of an orange box, and they call it self attention. And that's a misnomer. It's not what we call attention. It's really association. It's association, temporal association. And it's really a matrix. And so you have all the words, the tokens for the words, and then you look at the associations between words in a big window, right? The long input vector. Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so unfortunately, it is choking here. Okay, so what I was about to show you was that if you let's go back here. Okay, there you go. If you look at the cortex, it projects topographically down to the basal ganglion, and it loops back. It loops back just like this. It loops back. But not only that, but it also is regional. So each area, V1, V2, all of those have their patches in the basal ganglion. And you know, that suggests that maybe the basal ganglion may be doing something like self-attention. Okay, let's see about that. So this is to show you what self-attention might be doing. So this is a sentence: Bob, who is hopeful, likes Alice. Hopeful might be attached to Bob, or it might be attached to Alice. Now, it's obvious to you, but it's not obvious to, unless you're trained, you know, long training to know something about syntax. So the association matrix, which is learned, the self-attention matrix, links Bob to hopeful and with a positive value and a negative value for Alice. So that's what it's doing, is it's just accumulating that. By the way, you know, it's trained to predict the next word in the sentence, and that's all it is. It's self-supervised, right? There's no labeling of data. And it figures it out. Well, this is a little bit better diagram for what might be happening in the basal ganglia. So here's going up here, we see that there is a feed-forward projection from V1 all the way up to inferotemporal cortex, and from there to prefrontal cortex here. But there's also this loop from the cortex down to the basal ganglia and back, and there is some spread here. It's not one-to-one. It's broad. And there turns out to be traveling waves in the basal ganglia too. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so maybe using the same kind of space-time code. Now, because of the fact that each of these areas with
come on,
it's exactly the stack that we see in the transformer. So here's a hypothesis. Maybe what's going on is the basal ganglia is providing temporal context. We know the basal ganglia is important for generating sequences of actions. Like sequences, if you're learning a sport, you have to practice. If you're learning language, you have to practice. And maybe what's happening for language is that it's learning syntax. And maybe in the prefrontal cortex, it's regulating sequences of thoughts. So this is all speculative, but you know, these are things that could be tested. Now finally, the global activity in the cortex. We know that when the stimulus comes in, it propagates up the hierarchy into the prefrontal cortex. And then from there, it projects back, feedback connections. And here's an fMRI experiment in which they gave it a low contrast visual stimulus and radiate threshold, and you either see it or you don't. And it turns out that when you consciously perceive it, you get activity in the prefrontal cortex, and that then activates more activity in the back of the brain. But if you don't see it, it doesn't propagate back. So this is really telling us something interesting, and it maybe has something to do with the perception, and that could be Bernie Bars, who has a book on this, thinks it might be the basis of consciousness. Well, who knows? So here's the summary. I'm going to fill this void with two mechanisms, traveling waves that only take you up to a minute for triggering STDP. And together that takes you up to an hour or longer. And so here's the working hypothesis. And And in the last century, almost all the experiments that were done with fast sensory motor actions. You have the monkey sitting there, the stimulus comes up, it has to learn when to press the button, and that is all taking place in less than a second. And we now know it's really well established. The firing rate is a number of spikes that's important. And of course, you have many spikes because you've got to do this rapidly. You can't just depend on statistics. You need to have a really, really powerful signal. But there are things that happen on slower timescales, like long-term working memory. Maybe it's organized not by firing rates, but by spike timing. And here's the hypothesis you just heard. Traveling waves, by the way, it's sparse. The traveling waves are sparse. Only a few percent of the neurons spike when the wave goes through. So you can have many waves going through each other. But the key, though, is that it will, by the relative timing of the inputs coming in, it will activate 90% of the synapses that will then be there for thinking over the next hour. Thank you.
We have time for several questions.
Do you have any way to falsify this?
Yes. So I recently got a Pioneer Award to test it. And I'm collaborating with a bunch of neuroscientists, Earl Miller, for example, Mark Snitzer. But there's one obvious experiment that can be used for the space-time code, which is the prediction is, what people do, they reconstruct. What they do is they take activity pattern, the firing rates, at a time t, and try to reproduce what the image is, right? Well, what I predict is if you give it a movie and you take the population activity at time t, you should be able to reproduce previous frames, right? That's the prediction. You could do it. More theories. Let's have more theories. But I think if we pass that test, we're one step ahead. Okay. But by the way, the way to really test this, and this is what we want to do with Mark Snitzer, is use genetically encoded tools to specifically interfere with the traveling waves and not the firing rates. And then we can look for behavioral changes, right? So that will, I think that's really the key experiment, because you're going to test for the causal intervention that will help you understand whether traveling waves are important for higher cognition. Yes.
Repeat the question.
Well, the question is, how do you distinguish between traveling waves and interference patterns between inputs coming from several sources? In fact, you do get interference patterns. In fact, that's the key, is that you're taking information and recoding it in this interference pattern. And by the way, how many people here have ever seen a hologram? By a hologram, I mean the photographic plate that then, when you shine light on it, produces a three-dimensional object when you see it, of laser light. Okay, what does a hologram look like? Does anybody here know what a hologram looks like? Has anybody seen an actual hologram? Yes, go ahead. You can't see any image because it's just interference fringes. It's just light interfering with each other from many different directions. But when you shine a laser light with the right frequency, it suddenly reconstructs the image. It means the information wasn't lost, it was just recoded. And that's what a space-time code is. It's actually taking the information, it's all preserved, but now it's in a different form. And there's no reason it has to look like an image. There's no man sitting there looking at the spikes coming in, like the neuroscientist. And it's a very efficient code in terms of being able to represent time as well as space.
Well, so ChatGPT
no timing at the precision that you're describing with gamma oscillations and the collisions of traveling waves. So what is that? What are the implications of that?
You can't think.
What was the question?
GDP doesn't have any traveling waves, and so, you know, it looks like it's thinking, but it's not. As I gave you, what happens when you stop your dialogue, it just goes blank. Now here's something interesting. The engineers, Chris Ray at Stanford, replaced self-attention with a state space model. This is what engineers use for signal processing. And if you use a particular type of matrix called tuplets, which is diagonal, then it turns out that this can replace the self-attention box. And it's order n, only n parameters, so it's easier to train and it's faster. So interestingly, they didn't know this, but in fact, these tuplets matrices give you traveling waves. The ones that he used, there's traveling waves. So adding traveling waves actually helps, or it can reduce the complexity of the model. But what I think, though, what we need to do in addition is to be able to, at some point, if this works in humans, and as I said, we should be able to implement fast weight changes like in STDP. Now, it doesn't have spikes, but it turns out that there's a rate-coded version of STDP. And so that way, it should be able to then have a working memory, and it should be able to plan, and it should be able to think. Now, I'm not sure I want this to happen, but that's the answer. That's possible because of the fact that we have this dialogue now going between the people in AI and the people in the brain, helping each other.
Okay, can we?
One last question.
So, speed cycling.
Yes, it goes around a circle and you saw that. You didn't see it. You didn't see it for the sleep case. I'm sorry that you couldn't. But no, traveling waves, okay, it's all information in physics is transmitted by traveling waves, sound waves, electromagnetic waves, gravitational waves, right? That's how you get information from point A to point B. And now this is basically taking advantage of that in the brain. It's a dynamical mechanism, right? I think it's just another layer on top of what we already know. And that is going to take us into the cognitive realm.